Hannibal and the Alps. Before Hannibal could fight the Roman Empire, he first had to survive one of the deadliest mountain crossings in history. In 218 BC, Rome and Carthage were locked in a brutal struggle for power. Both wanted control of the Mediterranean, and neither side was prepared to lose. Leading Carthage was a military genius named Hannibal. He knew that attacking Rome head-on would almost certainly fail, so he made a decision that shocked both his allies and his enemies. Instead of sailing into Italy, he would march an army of around 50,000 soldiers, thousands of horses, and 37 war elephants over the towering Alps, hoping to appear where the Romans least expected. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was a nightmare. The moment Hannibal's army entered the mountains, the battle changed. The Romans were no longer the biggest threat, the Alps were. Narrow paths twisted along towering cliffs, where one misplaced step meant a fall that nobody survived. Thick snow swallowed the trails, leaving soldiers unsure where to place their next foot. Every meter climbed brought thinner air, freezing winds, and another obstacle standing between the army and Italy. Then the mountain struck. Without warning, huge rockfalls thundered down the slopes, crushing soldiers, horses, and vital supplies beneath tons of stone. Ice turned the paths into deadly traps. Even Hannibal's famous war elephants struggled to stay upright as the mountains seemed determined to push them back. As if nature wasn't enough, local mountain tribes watched from above, attacking at the worst possible moments before disappearing into the mist. Food became scarce, men froze where they stood. Others collapsed from exhaustion without ever seeing a Roman soldier. By the time Hannibal finally reached Italy, tens of thousands of his men were gone. The greatest battle of the campaign hadn't been fought against Rome, it had been fought against the Alps, and the mountain had won. Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush. Before three of the world's greatest superpowers could conquer Afghanistan, they all had to survive the same mountains. For centuries, the Hindu Kush has stood like a giant wall across Afghanistan. It has watched empires rise, invade, and eventually retreat. The British Empire learned it, the Soviet Union learned it, even the United States learned it. Each arrived with powerful armies, advanced weapons, and confidence that victory wouldn't take long. They were all wrong, because in Afghanistan, the mountain is often a greater enemy than the army waiting behind it. The Hindu Kush is one of the harshest mountain ranges on Earth. Many of its peaks rise above 7,000 meters, while narrow valleys and steep passes create natural choke points that are almost impossible to control. Every convoy, every tank, and every helicopter had to pass through terrain that seemed designed to slow an invasion. Then the mountains began fighting back. Thin air robbed soldiers of their strength. Freezing winters buried roads beneath meters of snow. Rock slides blocked the few routes that existed, while dangerous mountain passes left supply convoys exposed for kilometers. Even modern helicopters struggled in the thin air, limiting how much equipment they could carry and where they could safely land. For the defenders, it was the perfect battlefield. Hidden high above the valleys, small groups could strike from the mountains before disappearing into caves, ridges, and narrow passes that invading armies barely understood. Every bend in the road could hide another ambush. Every mountain seemed to be working against them. After decades of conflict, one thing became impossible to ignore. Different armies, different centuries, the same result. The enemy changed, but the Hindu Kush never did. The Italian Alps, World War I. During the First World War, thousands of soldiers were killed by an enemy that never fired a single bullet. By 1915, Italy and Austria-Hungary were fighting for control of the Alps. Both sides desperately wanted the mountain passes, knowing whoever held the high ground could control the battlefield below. But there was one problem: the battlefield was one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Instead of fighting in fields or forests, soldiers were forced to climb thousands of meters into the frozen peaks of the Italian Alps. Many spent months living inside tunnels carved directly into the ice, surrounded by freezing temperatures that rarely gave them a chance to recover. The enemy was no longer just across the mountain, it was the mountain itself. Winter storms buried trenches overnight. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, leaving soldiers with frostbite before they had even reached the front line. Every movement became dangerous as thick snow-covered cliffs, hidden crevasses, and narrow paths that could collapse without warning. Then came the avalanches, sometimes triggered naturally, sometimes deliberately by artillery fire. Millions of tons of snow thundered down the mountainsides without warning. Entire camps disappeared beneath the ice in seconds. Hundreds of soldiers could vanish before they even had time to react. One avalanche alone is believed to have buried thousands of men during what became known as White Friday, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters ever to strike a battlefield. By the time the fighting finally ended, many soldiers had never even seen the enemy who killed them. The mountains had claimed them first. In the Italian Alps, survival wasn't measured by winning battles, it was measured by surviving another winter. The Caucasus Mountains, Hitler. Hitler believed conquering these mountains would win him the war. Instead, they helped destroy his army. In 1942, Nazi Germany launched one of its most ambitious operations of the Second World War. Hitler ordered his forces deep into the Caucasus Mountains, hoping to seize the Soviet Union's rich oil fields. Without that oil, he believed the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. It was a gamble that could change the course of history, but there was one obstacle standing in the way: the Caucasus. Stretching between the Black and Caspian Seas, these towering mountains rise above 5,000 meters, creating some of the harshest terrain in Europe. Every road twisted through steep valleys, every mountain pass became a bottleneck, every kilometer forward made supplying an army even harder. Then winter arrived. Snow buried the few roads that existed. Thick fog reduced visibility to almost nothing. Vehicles became trapped in ice, while soldiers struggled through freezing winds carrying heavy equipment across mountains that seemed impossible to cross. The higher they climbed, the worse it became. Fuel, food, and ammunition took longer and longer to reach the front lines. Entire units became isolated, unable to move forwards or retreat. Even after German soldiers reached parts of the Caucasus, holding the mountains proved almost impossible as Soviet resistance grew stronger and supply lines stretched to breaking point. What had looked like the road to victory slowly became a trap. Hitler never captured the oil fields he desperately needed. Instead, his army was forced into a long retreat, abandoning the mountains they had fought so hard to reach. The Soviet army played a huge role in stopping Germany, but the Caucasus made sure the mountains were fighting on their side. Sarikamish. Before the Russian army could destroy the Ottomans, the mountains got there first. In the winter of 1914, the Ottoman Empire believed it had found the perfect opportunity to strike. Their plan was bold: march nearly 90,000 soldiers through the snow-covered mountains near Sarikamish, surprise the Russian forces, and crush them before they had time to react. On paper, it looked like a brilliant strategy, until the mountains declared war instead. The Ottoman army entered one of the harshest winters the region had seen in years. Temperatures plunged to around -30°C. Snow buried the narrow mountain trails, while freezing winds swept relentlessly across the exposed ridges. The soldiers weren't prepared. Many had little more than thin uniforms, worn-out boots, and limited food. As they climbed deeper into the mountains, they became scattered across miles of frozen terrain. Units lost contact with one another, supply wagons disappeared beneath the snow, and those carrying ammunition and food simply couldn't keep up. Then the cold began to kill. Men froze where they stood. Others collapsed from exhaustion after marching for days through waist-deep snow. Entire groups became lost in blizzards, never finding the rest of the army again. Some soldiers reportedly fell asleep beside the trail for just a few minutes. They never woke up. By the time the survivors finally reached the battlefield, the mountains had already destroyed much of the army. Tens of thousands were dead, frozen, starving, or too weak to fight. The Russians still won the battle, but they didn't have to do most of the killing. The mountains had already done it for them. Finland, the Winter War. The Soviet Union expected to crush Finland in just a few weeks. They never imagined the mountains would have other plans. In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland with overwhelming force. They had around 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. Against them stood a nation with only a fraction of the manpower and equipment. On paper, the outcome seemed inevitable, until the mountains changed the battlefield. Northern Finland wasn't built for massive armies. Endless forests, frozen lakes, and snow-covered hills broke the Soviet advance into long, vulnerable columns. Instead of fighting one enormous army, the Finns attacked dozens of smaller groups that had become trapped along narrow roads winding through the wilderness. Then winter took over. Temperatures plunged below -40°C. Soviet tanks struggled through deep snow. Engines froze overnight. Weapons jammed in the bitter cold, while exhausted soldiers fought frostbite almost as much as the Finnish army. The Finns, however, were prepared. Dressed in white camouflage, they disappeared into the snow. Moving silently on skis, they struck supply convoys, vanished into the forests, then attacked again somewhere else before the Soviets could react. Entire Soviet units became isolated, surrounded, and slowly destroyed using a tactic known as motti, where one large force was split into smaller pockets and defeated one by one. By the time the war ended, Finland had been forced to surrender some territory. But the Soviet victory came at an astonishing cost. A country expected to collapse within weeks had inflicted enormous losses on one of the world's largest armies. Every story in this video has shown mountains destroying armies, but Finland was different. Here, the mountains didn't destroy the army, they chose a side. The snow, the forests, and the frozen hills became weapons in their own right, helping a tiny nation humble one of the largest military forces on Earth. Sometimes the mountain is your greatest enemy, sometimes it's your greatest ally. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story.